We're ranking the 12 greatest transfers in the Mark Few era. Where do current stars Graham Ike and Ryan Nembhard slot in?
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Happy Friday and welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to provide news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Folks, it's the dog days of summer. The sports, they're not sportsing like we want them to, but this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So visit FanDuel.com to get started. All right, it's August, it's Friday, heading into a weekend. We're in the off season. We got some fun stuff lined up for you all. And today we are doing a ranking of the 12 greatest men's basketball transfers in the Mark Few era. I had a lot of fun compiling this list, putting it together, picked out of about 25 or so different names. Just threw together basically every transfer I could find since Mark Few took over as the head coach 25 years ago. Threw them on a list, ranked them 1 through 12. We are going to talk about them today in reverse order. So we'll do 12 through 9. We'll do 8 through 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1 to close out the show. We'll talk about some honorable mentions, and we'll talk about Ryan Nembhard and Graham Ike. They are both on the list. We'll talk about what they can do to potentially move up the list. And if we get some time, we might talk about where Michael Ajayi and Khalif Battle, and maybe even a couple years down the line, people like Emmanuel Innocenti or Braeden Smith, where they might slot in. Obviously, these kinds of lists are going to be very fluid, especially now in the modern transfer portal era, where we're going to see more and more players transferring in and out of all sorts of college basketball programs, including Gonzaga. But that is enough of a buildup. Let's get right into it here, starting at number 12. And the methodology, we'll talk about it throughout, but obviously trying to compare players who were at Gonzaga for 1 year versus 3 years versus tournament success and all that stuff was part of the challenge. And I'd love to hear your feedback, comments on YouTube, comments on Twitter, social media, Discord. If you haven't joined the Discord channel, I'm sure we'll be talking about this throughout the day on Friday. So definitely go hop in there and share your thoughts. If you haven't yet, free to join. There's a link in the show notes. Okay, now we've had enough preamble, enough buildup. Number 12 on our list here is Ryan Woolridge, who transferred to Gonzaga from North Texas, was at Gonzaga for 1 year in the 2019-20 season, averaged 10 points, 4.2 assists, 4.5 boards, 1.5 steals, and famously, at least famously by me, shot 43% from three in what I've deemed the Ryan Woolridge effect, as he was a 33% shooter throughout his career at North Texas, but blossomed as an outside shooter in his one season at Gonzaga. I think we didn't get to see Ryan Woolridge, the impact he could have potentially made, because he was part of that 1 year that didn't have an NCAA tournament, with COVID hitting in March of 2020. So very unfortunate for Ryan Woolridge, who transferred to Gonzaga in part because he wanted to play his fourth and final season of college basketball at a school where he could play in the NCAA tournament. Gonzaga was set to be a 1 seed almost certainly in that big dance, and he never got that chance. North Texas the next year actually did make the NCAA tournament after he had graduated. So just a sad story for him, but a very talented player who I think is more than deserving of being on this list. Number 11, Eric McClellan, from Vanderbilt. He also spent some time at Tulsa before coming to Gonzaga for 2 seasons, 2014-15 and 2015-16. Throughout his 2-year Gonzaga career, he averaged about just under 8 points a game, 2.5 boards, 1.5 assists, shot about 34% from three. He was the 2015-16 WCC Defensive Player of the Year, took home some hardware out of the conference. He also had some really clutch and key performances for Gonzaga, particularly in that 15-16 season when Gonzaga very narrowly made the NCAA tournament, almost broke the streak entirely. McClellan had 22 points against St. Mary's in the WCC Championship. Without him, Gonzaga maybe doesn't make the big dance. And a lot of the history, a lot of the storylines around Gonzaga change if they don't make the tournament as an 11 seed in that season and go on to make the Sweet 16 and start that streak of Sweet 16 appearances. So happy to have Eric McClellan on the list. Shout him out as well. He is a graduate assistant at Florida Atlantic right now, so cool to see him back in the college basketball ranks. Getting into the top 10, number 10, Micah Downs. Throwing it back to even before my time as a Gonzaga basketball fan and student, Micah Downs transferred to Gonzaga from Kansas, spent 1 year with the Jayhawks, then spent 3 years with the Zags, one of very few players, I think maybe actually the only player on this list who played 3 full seasons for Mark Few and the Gonzaga Bulldogs. That gives him a little bit of a bonus. Averaged 8.5 points a game in 3 seasons for the Zags, about 4 boards, 1.2 assists, was a kind of a prototypical stretch 4. Before that was a really popular thing. He shot about 40% from 3 in his 3 years at Gonzaga as a 6'8", 3-4 hybrid. He was all WCC tournament. He was actually a WCC tournament MVP as well, had a very successful career professionally, played a very long time all across Europe throughout his professional career. Maybe wasn't the biggest headlining player for Gonzaga, but had a very solid 3-year career for Mark Few and the Zags and put up productive numbers and taken home some hardware with that WCC tournament MVP. Number 9 on our list before we move on to the second segment, I had a hard time figuring out where to put Rasir Bolton. He comes in here at number 9, just inside the top 10. He doesn't have a lot of hardware. He didn't get any all-WCC accolades during the 2 years he was at Gonzaga. I think that was a mistake by the WCC voters. I think he should have been an all-WCC second teamer, at least honorable mention. He might have got honorable mention, but he was never on the second team. Probably deserves to be on the first team in some of those seasons as well. He came over from Iowa State. He'd also previously spent time at Penn State, 1 year at Penn State, 2 years at Iowa State, and then 2 years at Gonzaga. 2021-22 and 22-23 combined, he averaged 10.5 points, 2.4 assists, 2.2 boards, shot 42.5% from 3, was a catalyst for 2 of Gonzaga's best teams, 2 very, very successful teams, lost in the Sweet 16 to Arkansas and then lost to UConn the next year as well. A very talented player, adjusted to being less on ball, more off ball, improved as a 3-point shooter, is having a very successful, had a very successful rookie season overseas, and is having another successful season right now. So very excited to see Rasir doing well. He's also just like a great pillar for the community. And I think that did help me maybe move him up a little bit on this list because he was just he had such an impact on the city of Spokane in the 2 years that he was here, outside of just what he was able to do on the basketball court. Well, folks, are Ryan Nembhard and Graham Ike, are they top 5 transfers already in Gonzaga basketball history, or are they on the outside of the top 5 looking in? We're going to talk about that, what they might need to do to continue to move up those rankings, all that coming up in just a second. But first, let's talk about eBay Motors. Passion, drive, patience. That's the formula for winning championships, and it's also what helps keep your ride or die alive. And eBay Motors has everything that you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers to roof racks, exhaust kits to LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. Plus, with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or you get your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home that W. So keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply, and eBay's Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked on Zags podcast, still going through ranking the 12 best transfers in the Mark Few era of Gonzaga basketball history. If you want to learn more about the transfer portal, more about college basketball, check out the Locked on College Basketball podcast. We've been doing transfer portal updates on every conference, all of the Power 5 conferences. We're talking mid-major transfer portal updates next week as well. So definitely check that out if you want to get an update on how things have been going this offseason. Myself, my co-host Isaac Shade of Locked on Tar Heels. It's a fantastic show. Highly recommend. It is available wherever you get Locked on Zags. You can find Locked on College Basketball there as well. All right, number 8 on our countdown of the greatest transfers in Mark Few's era at Gonzaga, we're talking Ryan Nembhard. This is where Ryan Nembhard comes in after 1 season with the Gonzaga Bulldogs. We expect that this next season will fluctuate where he is in these rankings, hopefully for the better if he has another excellent year and leads Gonzaga to the Sweet 16, Elite Eight, Final Four, etc. Anything like that will change that legacy. But what he's already done, even just one season, the transfer from Creighton, he averaged 12.5 points, 7 assists, 4 boards, and just over 1 steal a game last year. He was all WCC. He was not WCC Newcomer of the Year or Player of the Year. Neither was Graham Ike. There was some controversy about that as Jonathan Mobo takes home Newcomer of the Year from San Francisco. Augustus Marcelonis takes home WCC Player of the Year. I think you can make a strong argument that both Ryan Nembhard and Graham Ike were better than both of those players last season, but I digress. For Nembhard, this is maybe a bit of an aggressive move. I think some people will say was 1 year of what Ryan Nembhard did last year better than the 2 years we got from Rasir Bolton, or the 3 years we got from Micah Downs, or even the 2 years from Eric McClellan. And I think there's an argument in both ways. I mean, certainly Nembhard struggled in the first half of last year, and I know a lot of people are still remembering that, are still feeling that. It was tough to watch. He really struggled with his outside shot, but what he was able to do in the second half of last year, his ability to carry this team back from the brink of feeling like that streak was going to end, to be such a dynamic playmaker, to improve his outside shot, to adjust his the way they ran that pick and roll to better suit his needs and what he was struggling with at that time, was tremendous. And I think we expect him to really hit the ground running this upcoming season, to the point where I think that maybe this is a bit of an aggressive spot here, but we feel very confident that he's going to lead this team next year, this upcoming season, as the starting point guard with the same cast and crew around him for the most part. I expect a big year. I expect all WCC accolades. Would not be surprised at all if he is Player of the Year or first team or in that conversation. It's not even outside the question that he's an All-American next year. So certainly he has to reach those thresholds to move up in this list. But right now where he stands, I think he's already a top 10 transfer in Gonzaga basketball history just based on what he did last season. And I feel the same about Graham Ike, and that's why he comes in one spot ahead of Ryan Nembhard as the 7th best transfer in Gonzaga basketball history, transferred from Wyoming. Obviously had sat out his entire previous year with the Cowboys with that foot injury. There was a lot of concern kind of even coming into his first season at Gonzaga. Is he going to be fully healthy? We knew he had a boot on when the school year started. Is this going to impact him? And it did not. He looked great from the get-go last year. He had some struggle. He kind of struggled to find his role a little bit early on, and we know Mark Few had a conversation with him where he said, hey, you need to be more assertive. You need to demand the basketball. You need to score when you get the ball. Like, that's the role that we brought you in here to do. You need to start doing that. And when that shift happened was kind of around the same time that the Zags started doing things slightly differently with their ball screen actions to force defenses to defend them a little differently. It was also around the same time that Ben Gregg stepped into the starting lineup and Dusty Stromer started coming off the bench. So there's a lot of things that kind of changed at that time, but a big part of it was Graham Ike's assertiveness and his just desire to be more impactful offensively for this team. He finished his first season in Spokane averaging 16.5 points, 7.5 boards, about an assist per game, was about 62% on 2-point shots. He was all WCC again, kind of startling. He was not the WCC Player of the Year. He should have won WCC Player of the Year, at least Newcomer of the Year. He should have been one of those two. He'll be back next year. Like we said with Nembhard, there's no question about his role. He doesn't have to find it. He doesn't have to get comfortable with his point guard, with his teammates. He now has a full year of that under his belt. There will be adjustments to players like Khalif Battle and Michael Ajayi and whatnot, but it'll be a much less of an overall adjustment than it was for him in his first year. So I expect him to have another fantastic year, build on those numbers that he had last year, put himself in the conversation to be WCC Player of the Year, to potentially be an All-American, similar to Ryan Nembhard. How these two guys do this upcoming season will obviously impact where they are in the rankings. But as it stands, after just 1 year, I still believe these are two of the top 10 best transfers in Gonzaga basketball history, with room for them to both potentially move into the top 5. And we're going to get to the top 5. We got 6 more players here. And while I think these two guys are capable of moving into the top 5, we should note it's a pretty tough list. There's some really good transfers that have come to Gonzaga. I know there's a lot of you who are trying to guess who the last 6 names are, and many of you are probably going to get them right because there's a lot of really good players that we have yet to talk about. Number 6 here on the list is Jonathan Williams, and I initially had him a little lower, and the more I kept looking at his stats and his performance and his impact for Gonzaga in his 2 years with the Bulldogs, I just kept feeling like, he's got to move up, and I think his accolades at this point do supersede where both Ryan Nembhard and Graham Ike are, in part because he spent 2 years at Gonzaga, and that obviously gives him an advantage. He transferred from Missouri, sat out a year, and then played 2 years at Gonzaga. He was part of the national championship team in 2016-17. He was a starter for that team. All told, in 2 years at Gonzaga, he averaged about 12 points, 7.5 boards, 1.2 assists, and 1 block per game. So again, the numbers aren't quite as good as Graham Ike's numbers. That's the easier comparison, just positionally. Same amount of rebounds, a little bit more assists for Williams, but he was like about 4 points less than what Graham Ike did. But Williams was a better defensive player. He was a better shot blocker. And he was, again, a key part of a team that went all the way to the national championship. If Graham Ike does that, he's going to probably move over him in this list in the future. But for right now, the fact that Williams has done that, he was a 2-time All-WCC player. I suspect Ike will also be a 2-time All-WCC player when his career is up. But for Williams, he gets the edge right now. I think he's a bit of an underappreciated player in kind of the history of Gonzaga basketball in the Mark Few era. We're into the top 5 now. And we got 2. It's a family affair here in the second segment. We talked about Ryan Nembhard to start the second segment at number 8 on the list. Now we get his older brother, Andrew Nembhard, at number 5. One of the top five transfers. I picked the 5 players in the top 5 very quickly, and I had a really hard time switching the order here. I think you could almost argue these top 5 guys, and we'll get to the other 4 in a second, could be ordered almost any way, but Nembhard is just on the outside of that top 4. But that's just more of a testament to how great the players in the top 4 are, rather than anything negative about him. Of course, he transferred from Florida, spent 2 years at Gonzaga. Wasn't expected to play that first year, got eligibility kind of right before the season started in that magnificent 2020-21 season, and then he was the full-time starter at the point guard position in that 21-22 season. Across those 2 years in Spokane, Nembhard averaged 10.5 points, 5 assists, 3 boards, 1.3 steals. He was 2-time All-WCC. He was the WCC tournament MVP. He was also WCC Sixth Man of the Year in his first season in Spokane. He was a second-round pick in the NBA draft, the first player of anybody on this list to have actually been selected in the NBA draft. What more can be said about Andrew Nembhard? We've talked about him so much on this podcast, his ability to be willing to play a complementary role in his first year coming to Gonzaga, despite, being an SEC starter, a guy who had NBA aspirations, to come off the bench in his first year, to then switch into the starting lineup and seamlessly adjust to playing alongside Jalen Suggs, to take over the reins in his final season. Just a tremendous story. One of my all-time favorite Gonzaga basketball stories is Andrew Nembhard's progression throughout his career, from Florida to Gonzaga to starter to second-round pick to all NBA to having a tremendous run in the playoffs last year to now being a key part of Team Canada's quest to win an Olympic medal. It's a fantastic story for Andrew Nembhard, incredibly well-deserved, and there was no doubt in my mind that he is one of the 5 best transfers in Gonzaga basketball history, and I think you could argue that he's higher than 5th, but that's where we got him right now. So who's ahead of him? Who are the 4 transfers at the very top of this list in the Mark Few era? We got a pair of point guards to talk about. We also got a current NBA star to discuss. All that coming up in just a second. But first, let's talk about FanDuel, folks. I love sports. You love sports. That's why you're listening to a sports podcast here in August. And yeah, it's the off season. It's the dog days of summer. We got fewer games. The sports, they're just not really sportsing like we want them to. However, FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime that I'm in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everyone, every day, all summer long. And speaking of Andrew Nembhard, Team Canada takes on Spain Friday morning. If that game hasn't started yet, they are 9.5-point favorites on FanDuel. Meanwhile, Team USA, they got a game later on Friday. They are 32.5-point favorites over Puerto Rico. I think they might clip that. That Puerto Rican team doesn't look all that great. Meanwhile, Serbia, who took down that Puerto Rican team earlier in the week, they are 14.5-point favorites over South Sudan, with Filip Petrusev, of course, in the mix there. That game will be on Saturday. If any of those or any of the other Olympic lines interest you, go to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. All right, folks, segment 3 here, closing out the show with the top 4 transfers in Gonzaga basketball and Mark Few's history, in the Mark Few era of Gonzaga basketball's history, I should say. Most of you, many of you, I'm guessing, have a good sense of who these four players are. At least you have a good sense of who a couple of them are. If you haven't taken the opportunity yet, see if you can try to guess who you think those top four are. And like I said, I think you can make an argument for a handful of different orders here. I'm not sure any different order would work, but I think that there's a reasonable argument that, 4 and 3 could be flipped, that Andrew Nembhard could be in the top four. Like, there's a lot of different ways you could order this. And that's, again, a testament to how talented and how fantastic the players that Mark Few has brought in via the transfer portal or, pre-portal era, just via transferring, have been. Number 4, coming from Kentucky, Kyle Wiltshire. Spent 2 years at Gonzaga, 2014-15, 2015-16. In his 2 years at Gonzaga, Wiltshire averaged 18.5 points a game, 6.3 boards, 1.7 assists. He shot 45% from three. There are few players who have been as automatic from beyond the arc as Kyle Wiltshire. That man was a dead-eye three-point shooter. He was a 2-time All-WCC player. He was WCC Rookie of the Year. In his first season, he was also a consensus All-American, one of 3 consensus All-Americans on this list, an incredible testament to transfer somewhere and then become an All-American at that school. He was also twice named WCC Tournament MVP, so both of his years at Gonzaga, when he was in the WCC Tournament, he was voted the best player in that spot. He helped lead Gonzaga to an Elite 8 in that 2015-16 season. He averaged over 20 points a game that year. That was the year that he was named as a consensus All-American. And I really struggled having him behind who I have number 3 on this list, who we'll talk about in a second, because again, 3 of the 4 guys here are consensus All-Americans. The other one was not, although I think there's a strong argument that he should have been. Again, I think there's a lot of arguments for the order here, but Kyle Wiltshire was a tremendously talented player. And I think when you kind of think about the eras of Mark Few's tenure at Gonzaga, like the Kelly Olynyk sit out, transfer, and then succeed, was kind of a catalyst for a lot of players to then transfer to Gonzaga, sit out a year, which at the time was obviously mandated by the NCAA, and then thrive. And Kyle Wiltshire kind of showed up right after Kelly left. And I think there's a lot of kind of similarities in that way of him. He was good at Kentucky, and he sat out a year, developed his game even more, and then blossomed into a star for Gonzaga. And then that's when you see Jonathan Williams comes after that, and a few other players, including the player that I want to talk about here at number 3, who is the only guy on this list in the top 4, actually one of 2 guys on this list who only spent 1 year at Gonzaga. That's Braeden Clark. Braeden Clark comes in at number 3, transferred from San Jose State, sat out a year, played for Gonzaga in the 2018-19 season, and he was magnificent. 17 points a game, 8.5 boards, 3.2 blocks, had the single season block record for a couple of years until Chet Holmgren broke it. 1.9 assists, 1.2 steals, shot 70.5% on 2-pointers. Braeden Clark was the most efficient and effective player in college basketball in the 2018-19 season. And that was the year that Zion Williamson was there. Braeden Clark, statistically, from an analytics perspective, from an advanced stats, he was a better basketball player at Gonzaga than Zion Williamson was at Duke. There's a reason Zion Williamson went number 1 overall and Braeden Clark went 21st overall, but also their NBA careers haven't looked that far apart, in part because of injuries for Zion Williamson. But Braeden Clark was tremendous. He was a tremendous defensive player. He was a tremendous scorer around the rim, an elite athlete. He was all WCC. He was the WCC Rookie of the Year and Defensive Player of the Year. He was a first-round draft pick. Comparing him and Kyle Wiltshire was very hard. Wiltshire had an extra year. Wiltshire's team went as his second year went as far as Braeden Clark helped lead Gonzaga to the Elite 8. Wiltshire's offensive performance was stronger in terms of points per game. He was an All-American, whereas Braeden Clark was not. But Braeden Clark was more versatile in terms of his impact offensively and defensively. I think that gives him a slight edge. He did have more of a professional or an NBA career than Kyle Wiltshire. I don't necessarily think that should matter. We're talking about what they did at Gonzaga, although it is a factor in the sense that Clark was drafted and is still playing in the NBA. Wiltshire's still playing professionally overseas, has had a very successful pro career. But these 2 guys I agonized over, like who should be 3rd, who should be 4th. I just think Braeden Clark's impact, even in just 1 season, was so dynamic. And that win over Duke and just everything that happened that year gives him a slight edge over Wiltshire. But I think you could argue this one either way. I do think, however, that those 2 guys need to be 3 and 4, because I don't think either of them should move into the top 2 over the top 2 players that we have. And again, Many of you probably know who our top two are. They both transferred from the same school. We'll go to number 2 here, and that's Dan Dickau, transferring from Washington to Gonzaga, going across the state. From Seattle to Spokane. He spent 2 years at Gonzaga from 2000, 2001, and then 2001, 2002. All told in those 2 years, he averaged 20 points per game, 5.3 assists, 3 boards, shot 46.5% from three in an era where there were not a lot of people shooting 45+% from three. He was 2-time All-WCC. He was WCC Player of the Year. He was a consensus All-American. He was WCC Tournament MVP, and he was a first-round pick in the NBA draft. Dan's, of course, always still involved with Gonzaga basketball. He runs a skills camp in Spokane. He does broadcasting for the team throughout the season. He's a very involved and dedicated member of the Gonzaga basketball community. But he was also kind of the first, and I think that matters in this context. Like, it's not Dan Dickau transferring to Gonzaga didn't start a wave of players transferring to Gonzaga necessarily, just because transferring was a lot less common 22 years ago. But it was his decision to transfer to Gonzaga arguably is what kept this program kind of from fading the way that so many other programs who have these miracle runs to the Elite Eight or Final Four. You don't hear about Loyola Chicago or Florida Gulf Coast or VCU or George Mason as often. And Gonzaga, the reason that Gonzaga became Gonzaga, there's a myriad of factors, but you do not get to have that conversation about how that happened without talking about Dan Dickau, because he made the decision to transfer to Gonzaga and he led this team and they make the NCAA tournament the next 2 years. The streak starts because of Dan Dickau. It becomes a streak. It doesn't just become a one and done, in part because of what he was able to do in 2 years at Gonzaga. He also had a lengthy NBA career before, again, kind of coming back to Spokane and becoming a pillar in the community. So I think all of those factors make him have a very strong case. There's no possible way to have him lower than 2, and I think there's a strong argument for him at number 1. However, as many of you probably have guessed, I ended up going with Nigel Williams-Goss at number 1. And again, Williams-Goss only actually played 1 year at Gonzaga. He was a student at Gonzaga for 2 years, same with Brandon Clark and many others on this list who sat out a year. But Nigel Williams-Goss led Gonzaga to a national championship appearance. That's not something that Dan Dickau did. And again, it's maybe unfair to compare the two. Nigel Williams-Goss had NBA talent around him. He had a really deep, prolific roster. One of the players on, from this list, Jonathan Williams, was a key part of that. Shema Karnowski, Zach Collins, another transfer, Jordan Matthews, who's to the top of our honorable mentions list. Like, that team was really talented, but Nigel Williams-Goss was the straw that stirred the drink for this tremendous Gonzaga basketball team. He was there for 1 year, 17 points a game, 6 boards, 4.7 assists, just under 2 steals a game. He was WCC Player of the Year. He was consensus All-American. He was WCC Tournament MVP, literally all the same accolades that Dan Dickau had during his career at Gonzaga. Obviously, Williams-Goss was not a first-round pick in the NBA draft. He only barely got a chance to stick in the NBA, unfortunately. He's had a very successful pro career overseas, was with Olympiacos this last year, one of the best non-NBA teams in the entire world. But for me, he gets the slight bump just because he was in my mind, the most important player on Gonzaga's first team that went to the national championship game. And it's very hard to not have that give him the edge. But again, I think there's strong arguments for either Dan or Nigel in that top spot. Honorable mentions, I mentioned Jordan Matthews already. He was kind of the most notable one that I just kept off the list. Most of these guys are guys who were at Gonzaga for just 1 year and who had very successful one seasons, but they just weren't quite at the level of like a Ryan Woolridge or somebody like that. Most of the guys on this list were there for 2 years or were really good for their 1 year. But outside of Jordan Matthews, Byron Wesley from USC, Admon Gilder from Texas A&M, Aaron Cook transferred in. I think he was from a mid-major school. I can't remember exactly where, actually. Gino Crandall from North Dakota, Drew Barham from Memphis, Malachi Smith coming over from Chattanooga. All those guys were kind of in my honorable mention list. There's some guys I'm sure I didn't mention here, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. Who do you think should have been in the top 12? Do you think Michael Ajayi or Khalif Battle with one season? We know it's only going to be 1 year for them. Do you think they can, what would they need to do to get into the top 12? Is it lead this team to a Sweet 16, Elite 8, Final 4? What about somebody like Braeden Smith, who's potentially going to be at Gonzaga for 2 years on the court and a third year as a redshirt? Could Emmanuel Innocenti do enough to sneak into this conversation? There's so many different caveats. We're going to continue to see transfers be a huge part of Gonzaga basketball's present and future. And I'm very excited to relitigate this conversation in a year, 2 years, 3 years from now, and kind of see what has changed. Like I said, if you have thoughts, questions, disagree, agree with the rankings, let me know in the comments. Let me know on the Discord channel if you have not done so yet. Free to join, link in the show notes. Come hang out with us over there. Folks, have a fantastic weekend. We'll be back next week with more Olympic coverage, more recruiting updates, more fun stuff like this as we get into the heart of the college basketball offseason. But that's going to wrap it up for me today, folks. Thanks again for listening. And until next time, as always, go Zags.